Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 76 The Kingdoms of South India, July 14, 1932. Let us have another look at India and see the shifting panorama of states and empires. Almost, it is like a great and unending movie film with silent pictures coming one after the other. You will remember, perhaps, the mad Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq and how he succeeded in breaking up the Delhi Empire. The great provinces in the south fell away and new states arose there, chief among these being the Hindu state of Vijayanagar and the Muslim state of Gulbarga. To the east, the province of Gaur, which included Bengal and Bihar, became independent under a Muslim ruler. Muhammad's successor was his nephew, Firoz Shah. He was saner than his uncle and more humane, but there was still intolerance. Firoz was an efficient ruler, and he introduced many reforms in his administration. He could not recover the lost provinces in the south or east, but he managed to check the process of the breaking up of the empire. He was particularly fond of building new cities and palaces and mosques and planning gardens. Firozabad, near Delhi, and Jaunpur, not far from Allahabad, were founded by him. He also built a great canal on the Jumna and repaired many of the old buildings which were falling to pieces. He was quite proud of this work of his and left a long list of the new buildings he had put up and the old ones he had repaired. Firoz Shah's mother was a Rajput woman, Bibi Naila, the daughter of a big chief. There is a story that she was at first refused in marriage to Firoz's father. Thereupon there was war, and Naila's country was attacked and desolated. Bibi Naila, on learning of the suffering of her people on her account, was much upset and decided to put an end to it and save her people by surrendering herself to the father of Firoz Shah. Thus, Firoz Shah had Rajput blood. You will find that such intermarriages between Muslim rulers and Rajput women became frequent, and this must have helped in developing a sentiment of a common nationality. Firoz Shah died in 1388 after a long reign of 37 years. Immediately, the fabric of the Delhi Empire, which he had held together, fell to pieces. There was no central government, and petty rulers bossed it everywhere. It was during this period of disorder and weakness that Timur came down from the north, just 10 years after Firoz Shah's death. He nearly killed Delhi. Slowly, the city recovered, and 50 years later, it again became the seat of a central government with a sultan at the head. But it was a little state and could not compare with the great kingdoms of the south and west and east. The sultans were Afghans. They were a poor lot, and even their own Afghan nobles got fed up with them ultimately and, in sheer disgust, invited a foreigner to come and rule over them. This foreigner was Babur, a Mongol or Mughal, as we shall call them now, after they settled down in India. He was directly descended from Timur, and his mother was a descendant of Chengiz Khan. He was at the time ruler of Kabul. He gladly accepted the invitation to come to India. Indeed, he would probably have come even without the invitation. On the plains of Panipat, near Delhi, in 1526, Babur won the empire of Hindustan. A great empire rose again, known as the Mughal Empire of India, and Delhi again attained prominence and became the seat of this empire. But before we consider this, we must look at the rest of India and see what was happening there during these 150 years of the decline of Delhi. Quite a number of states, little and great, existed in India during this period. In Jaunpur, newly founded, there was a small Muslim state ruled by the Sharki kings. It was not big and powerful, and politically it was not important. But for nearly 100 years in the 15th century, it was a great seat of culture and toleration in religion. The Muslim colleges of Jaunpur spread these ideas of toleration, and one of the rulers even tried to bring about that synthesis between Hindus and Muslims, of which I wrote to you in my last letter. Art and fine building were encouraged, and so were the growing languages of the country, like Hindi and Bengali. In the midst of a great deal of intolerance, the little and short-lived state of Jaunpur stands out, a haven of scholarship and culture and toleration. To the east, coming almost right up to Allahabad, was the great state of Gaur, which included Bihar and Bengal. The city of Gaur was a seaport communicating by sea with the coastal towns of India. In central India, west of Allahabad and almost up to Gujarat, was Malwa, with its capital at Mandu, which was a city and fortress combined. Here in Mandu, many beautiful and splendid buildings arose, and their ruins attract visitors still. Northwest of Malwa was Rajputana, with many Rajput states, and especially Chittor. There was frequent fighting between Chittor and Malwa and Gujarat. Chittor was small compared to these two powerful states, but the Rajputs have always been brave fighters. Sometimes, in spite of their small numbers, they won. Such a victory by the Rana of Chittor over Malwa was celebrated by his building a fine tower of victory, the Jaya Stambha in Chittor. The Sultan of Mandu, not to be outdone, built a high tower at Mandu. The Chittor tower still remains. The Mandu one has vanished. To the west of Malwa lay Gujarat. Here was established a powerful kingdom, and its capital, Ahmedabad, founded by Sultan Ahmad Shah, became a great city of nearly 1 million inhabitants. Beautiful buildings arose in this city, and it is said that for 300 years, from the 15th to the 18th centuries, Ahmedabad was one of the finest cities in the world. It is curious to find that the great Jami Masjid of the city resembles the Jaina temple built at Ranpur by the Rana of Chittor, which was built about the same time. This shows how the old Indian architects were being affected by the new ideas and were producing a new architecture. Here again, you see the synthesis in the field of art of which I have already written. Even now, there are many of these fine old buildings in Ahmedabad with wonderful carvings in stone. But the new industrial city that has grown up around them is not a thing of beauty. It was about this time that the Portuguese reached India. You will remember that Vasco da Gama was the first to come round the Cape of Good Hope. He reached Calicut in the south in 1498. Of course, many Europeans had previously visited India, but they came as traders or just simply as visitors. The Portuguese now came with different ideas. They were full of pride and self-confidence. They had the Pope's gift of the Eastern world. They came with the intention of conquest. They were small in numbers to begin with, but more and more ships came, and some coast towns were seized, notably Goa. The Portuguese never did much in India. They never got inland. But they were the first of the Europeans to come by sea to attack India. They were followed much later by the French and English. Thus, the opening of the sea routes showed the weakness of India by sea. The old powers of South India had dwindled, and their attention was diverted to dangers from inland. The Gujarat Sultans fought the Portuguese even by sea. They allied themselves with the Ottoman Turks and defeated a Portuguese fleet. But the Portuguese won later and controlled the sea. Just then, the fear of the Mughals at Delhi made the Gujarat Sultans seek peace with the Portuguese. But the latter played them false. In South India, there had arisen early in the 14th century two great kingdoms. Gulbarga, also called the Bahmani Kingdom, and to the south of this, Vijayanagar. The Bahmani Kingdom spread all over the Maharashtra area and partly over the Karnataka. It lasted for over 150 years, but its record is an ignoble one. There is intolerance and violence and murder, and the luxury of the Sultan and nobles side by side with extreme misery of the people. Early in the 16th century, the Bahmani kingdom collapsed through sheer ineptitude and was split up into 5 sultanates: Bijapur, Ahmednagar, Golconda, Bidar, and Berar. The state of Vijayanagar had meantime carried on for nearly 200 years and was still flourishing. Between these 6 states, there were frequent wars, each attempting to gain the mastery of the south. There were all manner of combinations between them, and these were always changing. Sometimes a Muslim state fought a Hindu state. Sometimes a Muslim and a Hindu state jointly fought another Muslim one. The struggles were purely political, and whenever any one state seemed to become too powerful, the others allied themselves against it. Ultimately, Vijayanagar's strength and wealth induced the Muslim states to combine against it, and in 1565, at the Battle of Talikota, they succeeded in crushing it completely. The empire of Vijayanagar ended after 2.5 centuries, and the great and splendid city was utterly destroyed. The victorious allies fell out amongst themselves soon after and fought each other. And before long, the shadow of the Mughal Empire of Delhi fell on them all. Another of their troubles were the Portuguese, who captured Goa in 1510. This was in Bijapur state. In spite of every effort to dislodge them, the Portuguese stuck to Goa. And their leader Albuquerque, who had the fine title of Viceroy of the East, indulged in disgusting cruelties. The Portuguese carried out a massacre of the people and did not spare even women and children. Ever since then, to this day, the Portuguese have remained in Goa. Beautiful buildings were made in these southern states, especially in Vijayanagar and Golconda and Bijapur. Golconda is in ruins now. Bijapur still has many of these fine buildings. Vijayanagar was reduced to dust and is no more. The city of Hyderabad was founded near Golconda about this time. The builders and craftsmen of the south are said to have gone later to the north and helped in the building of the Taj Mahal at Agra. In spite of general toleration of each other's religions, there were occasional bursts of bigotry and intolerance. The wars were often accompanied by frightful slaughters and destruction. Yet, it is interesting to remember that the Muslim state of Bijapur had Hindu cavalry, and that the Hindu state of Vijayanagar had some Muslim troops. There appears to have been a fairly high degree of civilization. But it was a rich man's show, and the man in the field was out of it. He was poor, and yet, as always happens, he bore the burden of the great luxury of the rich. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 77, Vijayanagar, July 15th, 1932. Of all the kingdoms of the south that we discussed in our last letter, Vijayanagar has the longest history. It so happened that many foreign visitors came to it and left accounts of the state and the city. There was an Italian, Niccolo Conti, who came in 1420, and Abdur Razak of Herat, who came from the court of the great Khan in Central Asia in 1443, and Pez, a Portuguese, who visited the city in 1522, and many others. There is also a history of India which deals with the South Indian states, and especially Bijapur. This was written in Persian by Farishta in Akbar's time, not long after the period we are considering. Contemporary histories are often very partial and exaggerated, but they are of great help. There are hardly any of these known to us for the pre-Muslim periods, with the exception of the Raj Tarangini of Kashmir. Farishta's history was thus a great innovation. Others followed him. The descriptions of foreign visitors to Vijayanagar give us a good and impartial picture of the city. They tell us more than the accounts of the wretched wars which were frequently taking place. I shall therefore tell you something of what these people say. Vijayanagar was founded about 1336. It was situated in what is known as the Karnataka area of South India. Being a Hindu state, it naturally attracted large numbers of refugees from the Muslim states in the south. It grew rapidly. Within a few years, the state dominated the south, and the capital city attracted attention by its wealth and beauty. Vijayanagar became the dominant power in the Deccan. Farishta tells us of its great wealth and describes the capital in 1406, when a Muslim Bahmani king from Gulbarga went there to marry a princess of Vijayanagar. He says that for 6 miles the road was spread with cloth of gold and velvet and similar rich stuffs. What a terrible and scandalous waste of money! In 1420 came the Italian Niccolo Conti, and he tells us that the circumference of the city was 60 miles. This area was so vast because there were numerous gardens. Conti was of the opinion that the ruler of Vijayanagar, or Raya as he was called, was the most powerful ruler in India at the time. Then comes Abdur Razak from Central Asia. On his way to Vijayanagar, near Mangalore, he saw a wonderful temple made of pure molten brass. It was 15 feet high and 30 feet by 30 at its base. Further up, at Belur, he was still more amazed at another temple. Indeed, he does not attempt to describe it, as he fears that if he did so, he would be charged with exaggeration. Then he reached the city of Vijayanagar, and he goes into ecstasies over this. He says, "The city is such that eye has not seen, nor ear heard, of any place resembling it upon the whole earth." He describes the many bazaars, noting that at the head of each bazaar there is a lofty arcade and magnificent gallery. But the palace of the king is loftier than all of them. He describes the bazaars as very long and broad, and says that sweet-scented flowers are always procurable fresh in that city, and are considered even a necessary sustenance. For without them, the people could not exist. He notes that the tradesmen of each separate guild or craft have their shops close to one another, and that the jewelers sell their rubies and pearls and diamonds and emeralds openly in the bazaar. Abdur Razak goes on to describe the charming area in which the palace of the king is contained, with many rivulets and streams flowing through channels of cut stone, polished and even, and says the country was so well populated that it was impossible in a reasonable space to convey an idea of it. And so he goes on, this visitor from Central Asia in the middle of the 15th century, waxing eloquent over the glories of Vijayanagar. It may be thought that Abdur Razak was not acquainted with many big cities, and so he was almost overcome when he saw Vijayanagar. Our next visitor, however, was a well-travelled man. He was Pais, the Portuguese, and he came in 1522, just about the time when the Renaissance was influencing Italy, and beautiful buildings were rising up in the Italian cities. Pais apparently knew these Italian cities, and his testimony is thus very valuable. The city of Vijayanagar, he says, is as large as Rome and very beautiful to the sight. He describes at length wonders of the city and the charms of its innumerable lakes and waterways and fruit gardens. It is, he says, the best provided city in the world, for unlike other cities, which often fail of supplies and provisions, in this everything abounds. One of the rooms he saw in the palace was made all of ivory, walls, chamber and pillars alike, with roses and flowers of lotus carved in ivory, so well executed and so rich and beautiful that one could hardly find another such room anywhere. Pais also describes the ruler of Vijayanagar at the time of his visit. He was one of the great rulers of South Indian history, and his reputation as a great warrior and as one who was chivalrous to his enemies, as a patron of literature and a popular and generous king, still survives in the south. His name was Krishna Deva Rai. He reigned for 20 years, from 1509 to 1529. Pais tells of his height and figure and even complexion, which he says was fair, describing him as the most feared and perfect king that could possibly be, cheerful of disposition and very merry, one who sought to honor foreigners and received them kindly, asking about all their affairs, whatever their condition might be. Giving the kings many titles, Pays adds that it seemed the king had, in fact, nothing compared to what a man like him ought to have. So gallant and perfect was he in all things. High praise indeed. The empire of Vijayanagar at this time spread all over the south and the east coast. It included Mysore, Travancore, and the whole of the present Madras Presidency. One thing else I might mention. Great irrigation works were erected about 1400 AD to bring good water to the city. A whole river was dammed up and a big reservoir was made. From this, the water went to the city in an aqueduct 15 miles in length, often cut out of the solid rock. Such was Vijayanagar. It was proud of its wealth and beauty and overconfident of its strength. No one thought that the end of the city and empire was near. Only 43 years after the visit of Pays, danger suddenly loomed up. The other states of the Deccan, jealous of Vijayanagar, formed a league against it and determined to destroy it. Even then, Vijayanagar felt foolishly confident. The end came soon, and it was terrible in its completeness. As I have told you, Vijayanagar was defeated by this League of States in 1565. There was terrible slaughter, and the sack of the great city followed soon after. All the beautiful buildings and temples and palaces were destroyed. The exquisite carvings and sculptures were smashed, and huge bonfires were lit to burn up everything that could be burnt. Destruction went on till only a heap of ruins was left. Never, says an English historian, never perhaps in the history of the world has such havoc been wrought, and wrought so suddenly on so splendid a city, teeming with a wealthy and industrious population in the full plenitude of prosperity one day, and on the next seized, pillaged, and reduced to ruins amid scenes of savage massacre and horrors beggaring description. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 78, The Malaysian Empires of Majapahit and Malacca. July 17th, 1932. We have been rather neglectful of Malaysia and the Eastern Islands, and it is long since I wrote about them. I have looked back, and I find that my last account of them was in letter 46. Since then, we have had 31 letters, and have now reached number 78. It is difficult to keep all the countries in line. Do you remember something of what I wrote to you just 2 months ago today? Of Cambodia and Angkor and Sumatra and Sri Vijaya? How in Indochina, the old Indian colonies developed in the course of many hundred years into one big state, the Empire of Cambodia. And then nature intervened and, harshly and suddenly, put an end to the city and the empire. This took place about 1300 AD. Almost contemporaneous with, that is, existing at the same time as, the Cambodian state was another great state across the sea in the island of Sumatra. But Sri Vijaya started a little later in its career of empire and outlasted Cambodia. Its end was also rather sudden, but it was man, and not nature that brought it about. For 200 years, the Buddhist empire of Sri Vijaya flourished and controlled almost all the islands of the East, and for a while even had a footing in India and Ceylon and China. It was a merchant empire, and trade was its chief function. But there arose another merchant state nearby in the eastern part of the island of Java, a Hindu state which had refused to be subdued by Sri Vijaya. For 400 years, from the beginning of the 9th century, this eastern Javan state was menaced by the growing power of Sri Vijaya. But it succeeded in retaining its independence, and at the same time in building an amazing number of fine stone temples. The greatest of these, known as the Borobudur temples, are still to be seen and attract numerous visitors. Having escaped the dominion of Sri Vijaya, East Java itself became aggressive, and in its turn became a menace to its old rival Sri Vijaya. Both were merchant states, crossing the seas for trade, and so they were often coming into conflict with each other. I feel tempted to compare this rivalry of Java and Sumatra with the rivalries of modern powers, say, of Germany and England. Java, feeling that the only way to check Sri Vijaya and increase its own trade was to add to its naval strength, developed its sea power greatly. Great naval expeditions were sent out, but often they did not come to grips with the enemy for years. So Java went on growing and became more and more aggressive. Towards the end of the 13th century, a city was founded, named Majapahit, and this became the capital of the growing Javan state. So presumptuous and arrogant did this Javan state become that it actually insulted some envoys of Kublai, the great Khan, who had sent them for tribute. Not only was no tribute paid, but one of the envoys had an insulting message tattooed on his forehead. It was a very foolish and dangerous game to play with a Mongol Khan. A similar insult had resulted in the destruction of Central Asia by Chengiz, and later of Baghdad by Hulagu. And yet the little island state of Java dared to offer it. But, fortunately for it, the Mongols had toned down a great deal and had no desire for conquest. Naval fighting was also not much to their liking. They felt stronger on solid land. Still, Kublai sent an expedition to Java to punish the guilty ruler. The Chinese defeated the Javanese and killed the king, but they do not seem to have done much damage. How the Mongols had changed under Chinese influence. Indeed, the Chinese expedition seems ultimately to have resulted in making Java, or the Majapahit Empire, as we shall now call it, stronger. This was because the Chinese introduced firearms into Java, and it was probably the use of these firearms that brought victory to Majapahit in subsequent wars. The empire of Majapahit went on expanding. This was not by chance or in a haphazard way. It was imperialist expansion organized by the state and carried on by an efficient army and navy. A woman, Queen Suhita, was the ruler during part of this period of expansion. The government appears to have been highly centralized and efficient. It is stated by Western historians that the system of taxation, customs, tolls, and internal revenues was excellent. Among the separate departments of government were a colonial department, a commerce department, a department of public welfare and public health, a department of the interior, and a war department. There was a Supreme Court consisting of 2 presiding officers and 7 judges. The Brahmin priests seem to have had a good deal of power, but the king was supposed to control them. These departments, and even some of the names for them, remind us to some extent of the Arthashastra. But the colonial department was new. The minister in charge of the Department for the Interior, which dealt with the affairs of the home state, was called Mantri. This shows that Indian traditions and culture continued in these islands 1200 years after the first settlements were made by the Pallava colonists from South India. This could only be so if the contacts were kept up. There is no doubt that such contacts were kept up by means of trade. As Majapahit was a trading empire, it is natural that the export and import trades, that is to say, the trades relating to the goods that were sent out and those that were received from other countries, were carefully organized. These trades were chiefly with India, China, and its own colonies. So long as there was a state of war with Sri Vijaya, it was not possible to have peaceful trade with it or its colonies. The Javan state lasted for many hundreds of years, but the great period of the empire of Majapahit was from 1335 to 1380, just 45 years. It was during this period, in 1377, that Sri Vijaya was finally captured and destroyed. With Annam, Siam, and Cambodia, there were alliances. The capital city of Majapahit was a fine and prosperous city with a mighty Shiva temple in the center. There were many splendid buildings. Indeed, all the Indian colonies in Malaysia specialized in fine buildings. There were several other great cities and many ports in Java. This imperialist state did not long survive its old enemy, Sri Vijaya. There was civil war and trouble with China, which resulted in a great Chinese fleet coming to Java. The colonies gradually dropped off. In 1426, there was a great famine, and 2 years later, Majapahit ceased to be an empire. It carried on, however, as an independent state for another 50 years, when the Muslim state of Malacca captured it. Thus ended the third of the empires which had grown out of the old Indian settlements in Malaysia. In our short letters, we have dealt with long periods. The first colonists came from India almost at the beginning of the Christian era, and we are now in the 15th century. So we have surveyed 1400 years of the history of these settlements. Each of the 3 empire states we have especially considered, Cambodia, Sri Vijaya, and Majapahit, lasted for hundreds of years. It is well to remember these long periods, as they give some idea of the stability and efficiency of these states. Fine architecture was their special love, and trade their main business. They carried on the tradition of Indian culture and mixed with it harmoniously many elements from Chinese culture. You will remember that there were many other Indian settlements besides the three I have especially mentioned. But we cannot consider each one separately. Nor can I say much about two neighboring countries, Burma and Siam. In both these countries, powerful states arose and there was a great deal of artistic activity. Buddhism spread in both of them. Burma was invaded by the Mongols once, but Siam was never invaded by China. Both Burma and Siam, however, often paid tribute to China. It was a kind of offering which a respectful younger brother might make to an elder. In return for this tribute, rich gifts came from China to the younger brother. Before the Mongol invasion of Burma, the capital of the country was the city of Pagan in North Burma. For over 200 years, this city was the capital, and it is said that it was a very beautiful city, its only rival being Angkor. Its finest building was the Ananda Temple, one of the most beautiful examples of Buddhist architecture in the world. There were many other magnificent buildings. Indeed, even the ruins of Pagan city now are beautiful. Pagan's days of greatness were from the 11th to the 13th century. There was some trouble and confusion in Burma for some time afterwards, and North and South Burma were separate. In the 16th century, a great ruler arose in the south, and he united Burma again. His capital was Pegu in the south. I hope this short and sudden reference to Burma and Siam will not confuse you. We have arrived at the end of a chapter in the history of Malaysia and Indonesia, and I wanted to complete our survey. So far, the principal influences, political and cultural, which affected these parts had their origin in India and China. As I have told you already, the continental countries in the southeast of Asia, like Burma, Siam, Indochina, were more influenced by China. The islands and the Malay Peninsula were more influenced by India. Now a new influence comes on the scene. This is brought by the Arabs. Burma and Siam were not affected by this, but Malay and the islands succumbed to it, and soon a Muslim empire grew up. Arab traders had visited these islands and settled there for 1,000 years or more. But they were intent on business and did not otherwise interfere with the governments. In the 14th century, Arab missionaries came out from Arabia, and they met with success, especially in converting some of the local rulers. Meanwhile, political changes were taking place. Majapahit was expanding and crushing Srivijaya. When Srivijaya fell, large numbers of refugees went to the south of the Malay Peninsula and founded the city of Malacca there. This city, as well as the state, grew rapidly, and by 1400, it was already a large city. The Javanese people of Majapahit were not liked by their subject peoples. As is usual with imperialists, they were tyrannous, and many people preferred going to the new state of Malacca to remaining under Majapahit. Siam was also at the time rather aggressive, so Malacca became a place of refuge for many people. There were both Buddhists and Muslims. The rulers were at first Buddhists, but later they adopted Islam. The young state of Malacca was menaced by Java on the one side and Siam on the other. It tried to find friends and allies among the other small Muslim states in the islands. It even appealed to China for protection. At that time, the Mings, who had displaced the Mongols, ruled in China. It is remarkable how all the little Islamic states in Malaysia turned to China for protection at the same time. This shows that there must have been some immediate threat from powerful enemies. China had always followed a policy towards the Malaysian countries of friendly but dignified isolation. She was not keen on conquest. She felt that she had little to gain from them, but she was prepared to teach them her civilization. The Ming Emperor apparently decided to vary this old policy and to take greater interest in these countries. He does not seem to have approved of the aggression of Java and of Siam. So, to check these and to make the power of China felt by others, he sent out a vast fleet under Admiral Cheng Ho. Some of the ships in this fleet were 400 feet in length. Cheng Ho made many trips and visited almost all the islands: Philippines, Java, Sumatra, Malay Peninsula, and so on. He even came to Ceylon and conquered it and carried off the king to China. In his last expedition, he went as far as the Persian Gulf. Cheng Ho's voyages in the early years of the 15th century had great influence over all the countries he visited. Wishing to check Hindu Majapahit and Buddhist Siam, he deliberately encouraged Islam, and the state of Malacca became firmly established under the protection of his great fleet. Cheng Ho's motives were, of course, purely political and had nothing to do with religion. He himself was a Buddhist. So the state of Malacca became the head of the opposition to Majapahit. Its strength grew, and gradually it seized the colonies of Java. In 1478, the city of Majapahit itself was captured. Islam then became the religion of the court and of the cities. But in the countryside, as in India, the old faith and myths and customs continued. The Malaccan Empire might have become as great and as long-lived as Sri Vijaya and Majapahit, but it did not have the chance. The Portuguese intervened, and within a few years, in 1511, Malacca fell to them. So the fourth of these empires gave place to a fifth, which itself was not to have a long life. And for the first time in history, Europe became aggressive and dominant in these eastern waters. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 79. Europe begins to grab in Eastern Asia. July 19th, 1932. We ended our last letter with the appearance of the Portuguese in Malaysia. You will remember my telling you a short while ago of the discovery of the sea routes and how the Portuguese and the Spanish had a kind of race to reach the east first. Portugal went east, Spain went west. Portugal managed to come round Africa to India. Spain stumbled by mistake on America, and later came round South America to Malaysia. We can now join up some of our threads and carry on our story of Malaysia. Spices, pepper and so on, as you perhaps know, are produced in hot climates, in countries near the equator. Europe does not produce them at all. South India and Ceylon produce some. But most of these spices came from the Malaysian islands, called the Moluccas. These islands are in fact called the Spice Islands. From the earliest times, there was a great demand in Europe for these spices, and they were regularly sent. By the time they reached Europe, they were very valuable. In Roman times, pepper was worth its weight in gold. Although spices were so valuable and were in such demand in the West, Europe took no steps to get them itself. For a long time, the spice trade was in the hands of Indians. Later, the Arabs controlled it. It was the lure of the spices that drew the Portuguese and Spaniards on and on from different sides of the world, till they met in Malaysia. The Portuguese had a lead in this quest, as the Spanish got busy, and very profitably busy, in America on the way to the east. Soon after Vasco da Gama reached India via the Cape of Good Hope, many Portuguese ships came the same way, and they went farther east. Just then, the new empire of Malacca controlled the spice and other trade. So immediately, the Portuguese came into conflict with it and with the Arab traders generally. Their viceroy, Albuquerque, seized Malacca in 1511 and put an end to Muslim trade. The Portuguese now controlled the trade to Europe, and their capital in Europe, Lisbon, became the great commercial center for distributing spices and many other Eastern goods in Europe. It is worth noting that although Albuquerque was a harsh and cruel enemy to the Arabs, he tried to be friendly with the other commercial people in the East. In particular, he treated all the Chinese he came across with especial courtesy, with the result that favorable reports of the Portuguese were carried to China. Probably, hostility to the Arabs was due to the Arab predominance in Eastern trade. Meanwhile, the search for the Spice Islands continued, and Magellan, who later crossed the Pacific and went round the world, was a member of the expedition which found the Moluccas. For over 60 years, the Portuguese had no rival in the spice trade to Europe. Then, in 1565, Spain occupied the Philippine Islands, and thus a second European power appeared in eastern waters. But Spain made little difference to Portuguese trade, as the Spanish were not primarily a commercial people. They sent soldiers and missionaries to the east. Meanwhile, Portugal had a monopoly of the spice trade, so much so that even Persia and Egypt had to get their spices through the Portuguese. They would not even allow anyone else to trade directly with the Spice Islands. So Portugal grew rich, but it made no attempt to develop colonies. As you know, it is a small country, and it did not have enough men to send out. It is surprising enough what this little country was able to do for 100 years, the whole of the 16th century in the East. Meanwhile, the Spanish stuck to the Philippines and tried to make as much money from them as possible. They did little except extort tribute. With the Portuguese, they had come to terms to avoid conflict in eastern waters. The Spanish government would not allow the Philippines to trade with Spanish America, as they were afraid that the gold and silver of Mexico and Peru might flow out to the east. Only one ship a year came and went. This was called the Manila Galleon, and you can imagine how eagerly this annual visit must have been awaited by the Spanish in the Philippines. For 240 years, this Manila galleon crossed the Pacific between the islands and America. In Europe, these successes of Spain and Portugal were making other nations turn green with envy. As we shall see later, Spain dominated over Europe at that time. England was hardly a first-rate power. In the Netherlands, that is, Holland and part of Belgium, there had been a revolt against Spanish rule. The English people, sympathizing with the Dutch and envious of Spain, helped the Dutch privately. Some of their seamen went about committing what amounted to piracy on the high seas by capturing the Spanish treasure ships from America. The leader in this rather risky but profitable game was Sir Francis Drake, and he called it singeing the King of Spain's beard. In 1577, Drake went out with 5 ships to plunder the Spanish colonies. He was successful in the raid, but he lost 4 of his ships. Only one of the ships, the Golden Hind, reached the Pacific, and Drake came back to England in this via the Cape of Good Hope. Thus he went right round the world, and the Golden Hind was the second ship to do so, the first being Magellan's Victoria. It took 3 years to go round. The singeing of the Spanish king's beard could not go on for long without leading to trouble, and soon war came between England and Spain. The Dutch were already fighting Spain. Portugal was also involved in this war, as for some years past, the same king had been ruling over Spain and Portugal. With a great deal of good luck and determination, England, to the surprise of Europe, came well out of this war. The invincible armada sent by Spain to conquer Britain was, you will remember, wrecked. But we are for the present concerned with the East. Both the English and the Dutch invaded the Far East and attacked the Spanish and Portuguese. The Spanish were all concentrated in the Philippines, and they could easily defend it. But the Portuguese were hard hit. Their eastern empire spread for 6,000 miles from the Red Sea to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands. They were established near Aden, in the Persian Gulf, in Ceylon, in many places on the Indian coast, and of course all over the eastern islands and in Malaya. Gradually, they lost their eastern empire. Town after town, settlement after settlement, went to the Dutch or the English. Even Malacca fell in 1641. All that remained were a few small outposts in India and elsewhere. Goa in western India was the chief of these, and the Portuguese are still there, and it forms part of the Portuguese Republic, which was established some years ago. The great Akbar tried to take Goa from the Portuguese, but even he did not succeed. So Portugal passes out of Eastern history. The little country had taken an enormous mouthful. It could not swallow it, and it exhausted itself in the attempt. Spain stuck to the Philippines, but played little part in Eastern affairs. The mastery of the valuable Eastern trade now passed to Holland and England. Both these countries had already laid themselves out for this by the formation of trading companies. In England, Queen Elizabeth gave a charter in 1600 to the East India Company. 2 years later, the Dutch East India Company was formed. Both these companies were meant for trade only. They were private companies, but they were often helped by the state. They were mostly interested in the Malaysian spice trade. India was at the time a powerful country under the Mughal emperors and could not be safely angered. The Dutch and the English often fell out amongst themselves, and the English ultimately withdrew from the eastern islands and paid more attention to India. The great Mughal Empire was then weakening, and this afforded an opportunity to foreign adventurers. We shall see later how such adventurers came from England and France and tried, by intrigue and fighting, to get parts of this dissolving empire. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 80. An Age of Peace and Prosperity in China. July 22nd, 1932. So you have been ill, my dear, and, for aught I know, may still be laid up. It takes time for news to reach the inside of a jail. I can do very little to help you, and you will have to look after yourself. But I shall think of you a great deal. Strange how we are all spread out. You, far away in Pune, Mummy, unwell in Allahabad, and the rest of us in various prisons. For some days, I have found it a little difficult to write these letters to you. It was not easy to keep up the pretense of having a talk with you. I thought of you lying ill in Pune, and I wondered when I would see you again. How many more months or years would pass before we met? And how you would have grown during the interval. But too much musing is not good, especially in jail, and I must pull myself up and forget today for a while and think of yesterday. We were in Malaysia, were we not? And we saw a strange happening. Europe was becoming aggressive in Asia. The Portuguese came, and then the Spanish, and later came the English and the Dutch. But the activities of these Europeans were for a long time largely confined to Malaysia and the islands. To the west, there was a strong India under the Mughals. To the north was China, also well able to look after herself. So India and China had little interference from the Europeans. It is but a step from Malaysia to China. Let us go there now. The Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, the Mongol, is gone. A popular rebellion drove the last of the Mongol forces beyond the Great Wall in 1368. The leader of the rebellion was Hung Wu, who began life as the son of a poor laborer and had little school education. But he was a good pupil in the larger school of life, and he became a successful leader and later a wise ruler. He did not get puffed up with conceit and pride because he had become an emperor. But throughout his life, he remembered that he was a son of the people. He reigned for 30 years, and his reign is remembered still for his continuous efforts to better the ordinary people from whom he had come. To the end, he retained his early simplicity of tastes. Hung Wu was the first emperor of the new Ming Dynasty. His son, Young Lo, was also a great ruler. He was emperor from 1402 to 1424. But I must not inflict these Chinese names upon you. There were several good rulers, and then, as usually happens, there was deterioration. But let us forget the emperors and consider this period in China's history. It is a bright period, and there is a singular charm about it. The word Ming itself means bright. The Ming dynasty lasted for 276 years, from 1368 to 1644. It is the most typically Chinese of all dynasties, and during their rule, the genius of the Chinese people had full scope. It is a period of peace, both domestic and foreign. There is no aggressive foreign policy, no imperialist adventure. There is friendship with the neighboring countries. Only in the north is there some danger from the nomadic Tartar tribes. For the rest of the Eastern world, China is very much the elder brother, the clever, favored, and cultured one. Very conscious of his superiority, but wishing well to the younger brothers and willing to teach them and share with them his own culture and civilization. And they, in their turn, all looked up to him. For some time, Japan even acknowledged the suzerainty of China, and the shogun who ruled Japan called himself the vassal of the Ming Emperor. From Korea and from the Indonesian islands, Java, Sumatra, and so on, and Indo-China came tribute. It was in Young Lo's reign that the great naval expedition under Admiral Cheng Ho went out to Malaysia. For nearly 30 years, Cheng Ho wandered all over the eastern seas right up to the Persian Gulf. This looks like an imperialist attempt to overawe the island states. Apparently, however, there was no intention of conquest or other gain. The growing power of Siam and Majapahit probably induced Young Lo to send out this expedition. But whatever the reason may have been, the expedition had very great results. It checked Majapahit and Siam and encouraged the new Muslim state of Malacca. And it spread Chinese culture all over Indonesia and the East. Because there was peace and friendship between China and her neighbors, more attention be given to domestic affairs. There was good government, and the burden on the peasantry was lessened by a lowering of the taxes. The roads and waterways and canals and reservoirs were improved. Public granaries were established to make provision for bad harvests and hard times. The government issued paper money and thus increased credit and facilitated trade and the exchange of commodities. This paper money was widely used, and 70% of the taxes could be paid in it. Even more notable was the cultural history of this period. The Chinese have for ages been a cultured and artistic people. The good government of the Ming period and the encouragement given to art brought out the genius of the people. Splendid buildings arose and great paintings, and the Ming porcelains are famous for their graceful shapes and beautiful workmanship. The paintings rivaled those great ones which Italy was then producing under the urge of the Renaissance. China, at the end of the 15th century, was far ahead of Europe in wealth, industry, and culture. During the whole of the Ming period, no country in Europe or elsewhere could compare with China in the happiness and artistic activity of its people. And remember, that this covered the great Renaissance period in Europe. One of the reasons why the Ming period is very well known artistically is because it has left for us numerous examples of its fine work. There are big monuments and fine carving in wood and ivory and jade, and bronze vases and porcelains. Towards the end of the Ming period, the designs have a tendency to become too elaborate, and this rather spoils the carving or painting. It was during this period that the Portuguese ships first came to China. They reached Canton in 1516. Albuquerque had taken good care to treat all the Chinese he came across well, and favorable reports had reached China. So they were well received. But soon afterwards, the Portuguese started misbehaving in many ways and erected forts at several places. The Chinese government was surprised at this barbarity. It took no hasty action, but ultimately, it drove the whole lot of them out. The Portuguese then realized that their usual methods did not pay in China. They became more peaceful and humble, and in 1557, they obtained permission to settle down near Canton. Macau was then founded by them. With the Portuguese came Christian missionaries. One of the most famous of these was Saint Francis Xavier. He spent a good deal of his time in India, and you will find many missionary colleges named after him. He also went to Japan. He died in a Chinese port before he was allowed to land. Christian missionaries were not encouraged by the Chinese. Two Jesuit priests, however, disguised themselves as Buddhist students and studied Chinese for several years. They became great Confucian scholars and also won reputations as scientists. One of these was named Matteo Ricci. He was a very able and brilliant scholar and was also tactful enough to get round the emperor. He threw off his disguise later, and through his influence, Christianity attained a much better position in China. The Dutch came to Macau early in the 17th century. They asked for permission to trade, but there was little love between them and the Portuguese, and the latter tried their best to prejudice the Chinese against them. They told the Chinese that the Dutch were a nation of ferocious pirates. So the Chinese refused to give permission. A few years later, the Dutch sent a big fleet from their city of Batavia in Java to Macau. Very foolishly, they tried to take Macau by force. But the Chinese and Portuguese were much too strong for them. The English followed the Dutch, but they also had little success. It was after the Ming period was over that they got a share in the China trade. The Ming period, like all things good and bad, came to an end about the middle of the 17th century. The little Tartar cloud in the north grew and grew till it cast its shadow on China itself. You will remember the old Qin, or Golden Tartars. They had driven away the Sungs to the south of China, and they, in their turn, were driven out by the Mongols. A new tribe, cousin to these Qins, now became prominent north of China, where Manchuria is now. They called themselves Manchus. It was these Manchus who finally replaced the Mings. But the Manchus would have had great difficulty in conquering China if China had not been split up into rival factions.
Foreign invasions in almost every country, China, India, and so on, have always succeeded because of the weakness of that country and the internal conflicts of its people. So in China, there were disturbances all over the country. Perhaps the later Ming emperors were corrupt and incompetent, or economic conditions were such as to bring about a social revolution. The struggle against the Manchus was also costly and became a great strain. Brigand leaders cropped up everywhere, and the biggest of these was actually emperor for a short time. The general of the Mings who was leading the armies against the Manchus was Wu Sanquei. He was hard put to it to know what to do between the brigand emperor and the Manchus. Very foolishly, or perhaps traitorously, he asked the Manchus to help him against the brigand. The Manchus gladly did so, and of course remained in Peking. Wu Sanquei then, convinced of the helplessness of the Ming cause, deserted it and joined the foreign invaders, the Manchus. It is not surprising that this man, Wu Sanquei, is loathed in China to this day and regarded as one of the great traitors of their history. Entrusted with the defense of the country, he went over to the enemy and actually helped him to bring about the submission of the southern provinces. His reward came by his appointment by the Manchus as the viceroy of these very provinces he had won for them. By 1650, the city of Canton was captured by the Manchus and the conquest of China was complete. They won perhaps because they were better fighters than the Chinese. Perhaps too long a period of peace and prosperity had weakened the Chinese in a military sense. But the rapidity of the Manchu conquest was due to other reasons also, notably the great care they took to conciliate the Chinese. In former times, the Tatar invasions were often accompanied by cruelty and massacre. On this occasion, every effort was made to win over the Chinese officials, and these very persons were appointed again to office. Thus, Chinese officials occupied the highest posts. The old Ming methods of government were also not changed. The system appeared to be the same, but the guiding hands at the top were altered. But two important facts denoted that the Chinese were under foreign rule. Manchu troops were stationed at important centers, and the Manchu custom of wearing the queue, or pigtail, was imposed on the Chinese as a sign of submission. Most of us have always associated the Chinese with these pigtails. But it was not a Chinese custom at all. It was a sign of slavery, like the many signs which some Indians adopt today without feeling the shame and the degradation of it. The Chinese have now given up the pigtail. So ended this bright Ming period in China. One wonders why it fell so rapidly after nearly 3 centuries of good government. If the government was as good as it is supposed to have been, why were there revolts and internal troubles? Why could not the foreign invaders from Manchuria be stopped? Probably the government became oppressive towards the end. And it may be that too much parental government weakened the people. Spoon-feeding is not good for children or nations. One wonders also why China during these days, highly cultured as she was, did not advance in other directions, science, discovery, and so on. The peoples of Europe were far behind her, yet you can see them during the days of the Renaissance, full of energy and adventure and the spirit of inquiry. You can compare the two to a cultured person of middle age, rather fond of a quiet life, not keen on new adventure and a disturbance of his routine, busy with his classics and his art, and a young boy, rather uncouth, but full of energy and inquiry and seeking adventure everywhere. There is a great beauty in China, but it is the calm beauty of the afternoon or evening. Dear friends and students, you were listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Please subscribe to the channel and help us grow. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.